Ja, så har vi en gave til jer. Udover smagsprøvene kommer senere, så har vi en særlig gave til jer, fordi vi er så heldige at have besøg her i landet af Dr. John Prescott, som også deltog i konferencen, symposiet her over de sidste par dage, som for øvrigt opholder sig i Danmark i den næste måneds tid. Professor Prescott har en interessant baggrund. Han er uddannet inden for eksperimentel psykologi, og så har han i mange år arbejdet på forskellige institutioner, blandt andet i Australien og New Zealand og senest i Italien, inden for sensoriske videnskaber, psykologi og fødevarevidenskab. Han er redaktør af et af de mest velanskrevne tidsskrifter om fødevarer og madpræferencer. Og han er forfatter til en bog, som jeg ikke kan anbefale nok, som hedder, den vidunderlige titel hedder Taste Matters. Taste Matters, Why We Like the Food We Do. Og jeg håber virkelig, at den bliver oversat til dansk. So John, I'm giving a commercial for your book while I'm introducing you. And I do hope that you'll succeed to get this translated into Danish. It's a book that is really worthwhile reading. And it's a wonderful read, it's easy read, and I think it's going to be and already is a very important book. So we're very fortunate to have John with us today, and he is going to tell us about why we like the food we do.
It's a great pleasure and a great honour to be invited here to give a talk at this opening of the centre. It's not for the first time that the rest of the world looks at Denmark and says, well, what a sensible thing they're doing, and both in cultural and scientific spheres. And you can look at a centre for taste like this and realise that it's going to be an extremely important centre for helping us understand not just I guess, basic sciences, but the application of those sciences to real-world problems like the health of you and your children and so on. So it's very impressive, and as I say, a great honour. Now, I thought I would start off my talk today by with a quote from well-known Danish royalty. And I put that quote up because it gives you one example of where we use the word taste in our everyday language, or at least when I say we, Shakespeare used the word taste. And I can't promise you a passionate speech, but what I'm going to try and do is to show you, in fact, I'm an academic, so I study taste, okay, and associated senses and how food preferences are formed. But I'd like to show you that, in fact, you all know quite a lot about taste already from your language. And I'm going to show you some science, but I'm going to show how it relates back to our everyday language and our everyday understandings of taste, which are not only not at odds with the science, but are often a reflection of it. So, I first went to the Oxford English Dictionary, largely because I've got one and you've got to use it, you know, because it's so thick and expensive. And I came up, you don't really, I'm going to go through these each in turn, so you'll see these come up again, but we've got sort of 5 main definitions of taste. Taste is all sorts of things, and depending on who you ask, what is taste? Well, it's the ability to show good judgment in purchasing furniture is taste. Oh, really? Well, how does that relate to, you know, the stuff that we put in our mouths? So I'm hoping to show you exactly how those sorts of things are linked. Taste is, in fact, embedded in our language, and I'm hoping that Danish is not too different from English. I think English borrowed 1 or 2 things from Denmark, or maybe English gave you everything. I'm not sure, one way or another. But certainly in English, we see a lot of metaphors, probably they're metaphors, for all sorts of emotional experiences and qualities. And you don't see this with any other sensory system. There's something about the sense of taste which seems to be related to emotions, seems to be related to evaluations. So in particular, sweetness. In English, we talk about the sweet smell of success. We talk about victory being sweet. We talk about the sweet spot, so when Roger Federer, hits a winner, the ball has come off the sweet spot of his racket. We talk about sweetness as a metaphor for pleasure. So we talk about sweet soul music, and there's lots of other examples I could give you. Or desire. We call our loved one sweetheart or my sweet. And we use the word sweet to help us overcome some initial fears and poor reactions, so that, if you're a little bit worried about eating offal, that the idea was, by somebody or other, that it would be a terrific idea to call them sweetbreads, and maybe you'll eat them. Negative emotions, too, are built into the language and access our knowledge of sweetness. So we talk about people becoming embittered by failure or by loss. We talk about bitterness in terms of disappointment and distaste and hatefulness and resentment. Or sourness. People have a sour face and they're discontented in some way or ill-tempered, and we express that in terms of a taste. So there's lots of examples, but I'm giving you just a few here. And I'm going to show you that these metaphors come out of really what taste is all about. So let's start off. What is taste? Well, our first definition from the Oxford English Dictionary says it's the action of tasting or perceiving a flavour or the sensation produced in the tongue or other organ by contact with a soluble substance. It's pretty dull, okay. I've underlined in the tongue because sensations don't happen actually in the tongue or the eye, they happen in the brain, so I was just correcting them there. But when we talk about the taste from an academic point of view, the gustatory system, we recognise that it has a few small qualities, a small number of qualities. Sweet, sour, salty, bitter have been talked about for at least 2,000 years, since the time of Aristotle. More recently, we talk about a fifth taste called umami, which in English language actually has a reasonable translation of savoury. And I'm sure there's something in the Danish language as well we recognise. Possibly fat. People are talking about the taste of fat as being a primary taste. Now, if you wanted to describe an apple, you're going to have trouble if you only use those tastes, okay? Because we know it's sweet and it's sour, it's not salty. Could be bitter, I guess. Not really very much umami, not very savoury, not very fatty. So, in other words, a complete description of an apple is something which is salty, which is sour and sweet. And clearly that's not true. If you want to describe, and this is what people in food sensory evaluation do, they describe things like apples in terms of stewed flavour and honey flavour and floweriness and grassy odour and so on. And I show you this example simply because this idea of taste actually, from the dictionary, is really to say that we don't perceive tastes alone in food. What we perceive in food is flavours, okay? And flavours include taste, they always include taste, but there's something more. So in other words, we often talk about the taste of an apple, but actually what you mean by that is a flavour. And you're quite right, because flavours are really what foods are all about. And they include taste, but they also include odours. Often they include tactile sensations from the mouth. Some people would say that they include sights and sounds. I wouldn't, but some people say that. But what we need to understand is that the brain assembles. It takes information from the taste system and from the olfactory system, our sense of smell, and assembles flavours into the brain. And you can actually even identify, using brain scanning techniques, where a flavour is located. And it's not the same as places of taste, and it's not the same place as an odour. It's a unique sense. And in fact, if you go back, as I say at the bottom there, you can actually, the whole idea of flavours is actually very old. This is a 17th century definition that a flavour is a quality perceived by taste, aided by smell. Nowadays we'd say smell is a very, very big part of it. And that, as I say, is consistent with our everyday thinking. The important thing for you to know about this is that, and if you're not in the science, you may not know about things like this. I've got a pointer. I don't know that I do. Oh, there it is. Thank you. So, in fact, when we're perceiving flavours, it's not a very clear slide, I'm sorry, but you know, the odours and the taste, our piece of apple goes in the mouth there and is chewed, and the tongue is responsible for tastes, of course, you know that. But the volatile chemicals from the apple go through the back of the mouth and reach the smell receptors. They're the same smell receptors as when we're sniffing, but this is a different way of getting to them. And that combination of the taste and the smell in the same place leads us to perceive flavours, and leads, as I say there, to development of preference, which I'll be getting on to. Now, there are some very obvious examples, and I won't dwell on this too much, obvious examples of the consequence of combining tastes and odours together. And I guess it's true in Danish as it is in English. If you smell something like strawberries or caramel or vanilla, the most common word in English we would use is to say, well, it smells sweet. And the reason that's happened is because the brain is combining the taste and the smell together, okay? And it doesn't really distinguish. It's all about the flavour of the strawberry. And likewise for a lemon or for vinegar, you say it smells sour. And that's because in the past, these smells, the odours and the tastes have always been experienced together. And that's why vanilla always smells sweet, because you never experience vanilla and salty. Well, you might in the Nordic Food Lab or at Nome or somewhere, but in the real world, you don't. And this has been well known. I mean, the French sort of philosopher of taste, Jean-Althème Brelat-Savarin, it's a wonderful book called The Physiology of Taste. It's not about physiology at all, but he sort of musings and meditations about taste, and he said in 1825, "I'm tempted to believe that smell and taste are in fact but a single sense whose laboratory is the mouth and whose chimney is the nose." And in science too now we think about the flavour sense. All right, so that's one sense in which we think about taste. The next one is another definition. It's a blend of two words, tangere and gustare, so touch and taste, okay? That's where the word taste comes from. Well, isn't touch separate from taste? Well, of course you can say that. You don't have to use the taste system. But I put these little babies' photographs to show you, and anybody who's ever had any dealings with a young baby will know that one of the things that they do is they spend their time exploring the world through their mouth. And the reason is because it's much more heavily innervated with receptors in the tongue and the lips than it is in the hand. It's a better place to explore the world with. You've got more nerve cells there. And so we think about the tongue as a place where we manipulate food, and we also experience taste on there. But in fact, the tongue, if you cut it open, don't try it at home, you'd find that there are lots and lots of receptors and nerves that are to do with the sense of touch and the sense of temperature and so on than there are actual taste nerves. And if we look here at this is a surface of the tongue which has been stained, and what sits up here are these little structures, and they contain the taste buds, and you can look at those in the privacy of your own home tonight if you like in the mirror, but they contain not only the taste buds, but they contain the fibres that are to do with the touch. When we have a nice curry, and we find it very, very hot, it's these fibres from this system, it's called the trigeminal system, that are actually being stimulated, not our taste buds, but actually they're in the same structures here. So in fact this is absolutely correct, that really it's almost impossible to taste without touching, and the two are completely interlinked. And so the baby is a reflection of what the baby is doing, is exploring the world through the sense of touch, and it will later come to explore the world through the sense of taste. Our next definition is of taste, and yet more Shakespeare here. An old-fashioned definition, perhaps, but very, very accurate. What is taste? It's a test or an examination. And Lear says he wrote this but as a test of my virtue. He was testing my virtue by writing something, okay? A taste of my virtue, but he meant a test. Well, that's extremely accurate. Our taste sense is largely, our responses to taste at any rate, are largely innate. It's the only sensory system that's true of. We're not born liking the colour blue, okay, or the sound of a violin, or anything. It's only in the taste system that we're born with inbuilt likes and dislikes. We're born liking sweet tastes, and you can see that's a little baby that's never been fed, it hasn't received any feeding from its mother, and a scientist was allowed in to do his dirty work and gave the baby some sugar on the tongue. And what does it do? Licks its lips. What does a rat do? Licks its lips. On the other hand, you put a bit of quinine, that's the sort of bitter substance in tonic water, and what does the baby do? It does exactly the same as you or I would do if we found it too bitter. And what does the rat do? Exactly the same. And you can show that with a lot of mammalian species. Our taste preferences are innate, and they're also, interestingly, and I'll come back to this later, interestingly, the earliest sources of pleasure and pain that we experience as humans. And I'm going to try and make a case for why that's important later. Cross-culturally, you can show that tastes are, or at least provide evidence, that tastes are all, our response to tastes are independent of diet. So here's three groups, Australians, Japanese and Chinese, very different diets, but yet when you give them these are increasing concentrations of sweet taste and a bitter taste of caffeine, and when you ask them how much they like them, you get exactly the same patterns across three cultures with vastly different dietary experiences. So this suggests there's something innate about taste. Well, if you're born with a fixed response to something, the only question to ask is, why is that? What's happening here? What's the advantage of that, in other words, in evolutionary terms? And we sort of think that we know. We've evolved to respond to basic tastes because of their survival value. And this is why the taste system itself actually acts as a test, because it's a test of nutrients and toxins. That's exactly what our taste system is doing. It's testing for the presence of nutrients and toxins. So in the case of sweet, we know that the only mammals that respond to sweet substances, by and large, are the ones that eat plants. And they get carbohydrates from plants. Cats are indifferent to sweet tastes, whereas we quite like them, and dogs like them, and so on. And if you're at all inclined to eat plants in your evolutionary history, then you sense taste and you like it, because it's a signal for calories. Sourness is typically disliked, particularly at high levels, and we think that it's a signal for ripeness, spoilage. And clearly, when fruit is unripe or fruit is overripe, it's much more sour. And so it's a signal telling us at what point we should be eating food. Saltiness, which is liked, of course, is very easy to explain, because if you don't take, it's the only mineral, if you don't take it in your diet, you will die, and you will die very quickly. And so it makes enormous evolutionary sense. Well, bitterness, if we're in the forest, if our ancestor were in the forest and was hungry and came across something that was bitter, almost inevitably they would have rejected it. Now, it's not an absolute test, but it's a good signal if something is bitter than actually might be poisonous. Umami, this fifth taste, well, certainly in foods, it's highly liked, and that's one of the reasons why we add all sorts of things like tomatoes, mushrooms, Parmesan cheese to our dishes because we're throwing in umami. We're not quite sure about this, but the preeminent explanation is that it's telling us about the presence of amino acids or proteins, again, which are important to take in the diet. And fat, if it is a taste, and we're not quite sure, again, is a bit like sucrose in that fat is a tremendously high source of energy, which will help us survive. So that's what our taste system is doing. It's testing its environment, testing the foods, testing things it comes across to see if any of these things are present. Another definition is a small portion or a sip of a food or drink to be tasted as a sample. It's a bit like what the royalty used to do in medieval Europe. They'd have a taster to see if something was poisoned. It's an experiment. It's trying to work out whether something is good or bad before you actually take in the whole lot. And the taste system is exactly like that. Now, I'm going to illustrate that point by looking at some of the things that stop us from eating. And I hope that will become clear. It looks like, on the surface of it, you know, if you look at the things that we eat cross-culturally, it looks like we eat anything, okay? And so here's two examples, one from Iceland and one from Finland. So I've gone all, you know, Scandinavian on you. But you could pick examples from anywhere. I particularly like this because it's, we've got a couple of quotes here. The Anthony Bourdain, who's a famous American chef, the single worst, most disgusting and terrible tasting thing he's ever eaten. Gordon Ramsay, and you can look this up on YouTube, and I suggest you put in the word Hakal and Gordon Ramsay, and he tastes it. He doesn't say bloody hell, he says something else, okay? But it's the same sort of exclamation of surprise and shock, and then he asks somebody to quickly get a bucket, and then he vomits. So it's nice. But the Icelandic people love it, apparently. And of course we've got this Finnish licorice, which I haven't tried, but it doesn't sound particularly pleasant, and yet the Finns adore it. It just shows you what the Finns are like. So it looks like we can almost eat anything, but in fact, there's lots of things that stop us, you know, there's lots of things we take advantage of our taste system broadly, including our eyes, our senses generally, to tell us whether something is likely to be okay to take in. And one criterion that we use that's very, very important is if we can't predict the taste of something, then we tend to reject it out of hand. And I've got two examples here. The one on the left is, that's sort of pink coloured. Now, if you were given that and you were told that that was a smoked salmon mousse, and it was, then you think, oh, that's very nice. If you were given that and you were told it was ice cream and it still tasted like smoked salmon, it's still the same substance, but in fact, it's likely that the surprise you experience would lead you to reject it. And that's exactly what my colleague Martin Yeomans, in collaboration with the chef Heston Blumenthal, showed, that here's a rated pleasantness, and here was the food label. When it was labelled ice cream versus when it was labelled savoury mousse or just something neutral, you can see that when it was labelled ice cream, it was chilled and so on. People rejected it. They found it very, very unpleasant, despite the fact that the flavour was exactly the same. So that's a key thing, that if our expectations aren't met, it's possibly a signal of danger, of unfamiliarity, unpredictability, and that's a problem, okay? We want the familiar. Here's another example on the right-hand side, and this was done by the Guardian newspaper sometime late last year, where they took some Pringles, new flavour of Pringles crisps around in a shopping centre and filmed them, and they said, well, taste this. And they filmed people's expression. It's a potato crisp, right? But this woman's clearly showing absolute disgust at that. And why? Well, the answer is that the flavour was chocolate mint. Now, it's not that chocolate mint's a terrible flavour. It's not that chocolate mint per se says, oh, God, this could be, you know, it could be dangerous, but it's the unpredictability which is a problem to our brains. We don't like that. In fact, one man in this film clip said, actually, chocolate mint's my favourite flavour, but he still had that same expression when in the context of a crisp. So the context is almost everything. Well, as I said a moment ago, it looks like we eat almost everything, but in fact that's simply not true. We can eat almost everything, but we're presented with a thing called the Omnivores Dilemma. And we're very lucky, just like rats, that we can eat meats and we can eat plants and, you know, things that the Nordic Food Lab throws at you, you can eat, probably. In the wild, you can eat almost anything. But almost anything is almost certainly going to include things which are toxic, that could poison you. So it's a great advantage, and on the one hand, lots of sources of food, but on the other hand, also increases your source of potential danger. By contrast, an animal like this, and we could include other animals, we could include the koala, we could include the panda, animals that only eat one thing, never worry about, they don't have an omnivore's dilemma. You know, blood is never going to poison them. That's all they eat. But they're limited. If blood isn't available, they die. So they're very limited. So it's a trade-off. And on the whole, I'd rather be an omnivore. Now, this dilemma has one consequence, and that is that we develop a thing called food neophobia. Now, anybody who's ever had small children probably knows a lot about food neophobia. And it's characterised by children typically starting at about the age of 2, give or take, where a child will say, oh, I don't like that. But you've never tried it. No, but I don't like it. And what they're saying to you is, I don't like it because I've never tried it. These two things aren't a coincidence. They're saying, I'm not eating that because I've never tried it. And the mother will always say, well, come on, you know, please just give it a try. No, it's a problem. And the reason is that this developmental stage that children go through is a way of protecting themselves. Again, think about our evolutionary history in the wild. About 2 years old would be the time that humans started to wander away. They can now walk. You can now wander away from your parents, and you can now come into contact with things which are, again, potentially dangerous. And so how do you deal with that? You become very, very, very conservative about what you... Is that 15 minutes, did you say? Okay. Yeah. Okay, you become very, very conservative in what you eat, and that helps you survive. Now, of course, some people, adults, still have high levels of food neophobia, but the important thing to note is that fear of taste, fear of a bad taste, is the mechanism, and as a corollary, the remedy is actually creating expectations of a good taste. We can also look at the Omnivores Dilemma in terms of how cultures are actually deal with it. So, if you're in a culture and your food supply changes, what's to prevent you from rejecting foods which are now novel and possibly dangerous? You don't know. Well, so cultures develop these things called flavour principles, and they help us to make things familiar. So if you're in Vietnam and you normally eat chicken, and your chicken is not available, you have to eat pork, which you've never had, how do you stop people rejecting it? Well, you cook it in fish sauce, lemongrass and coconut, and becomes instantly part of your culture. It's a Vietnamese dish from then on. And so these flavour principles are the way of not only a culture expressing itself, but actually of maintaining a flexibility in sources of protein particularly that come into the society. So, well, the other thing which is particularly a taste-related emotion is this idea of disgust. And again, that's an emotion which is helping us. Here you see two people, a tribesman, modern-day tribesman who's had very little contact with the West from New Guinea, and somebody from the 19th century expressing the same emotion. We don't know what in the case of this gentleman, but he's just been told to imagine that he's seen a dead pig in the road that's been lying there for a week in the hot sun, and he's disgusted by it. Now, why do we have that emotion? Well, the thinking is really that it's helping us to avoid foods. We're testing foods, helping us to avoid them because they might contaminate us. So it's inbuilt disease avoidance mechanism. Now, from the point of view of this Band-Aid on the pizza or the rotting roll there, that you think, well, that's fair enough, you know, you wouldn't want to eat that. But think about the problem you have, and some of the issues that the Nordic Food Lab is dealing with, is how do you get people to eat something like insects? Chopsticks or no, I'm not eating a grasshopper. I'm going to have to go very quickly because I've been given such a short time by our chairman, unreasonably. But I'm going to go quickly because I just want to talk about the mechanisms of how taste preferences developed. I'll go through these quite quickly. Well, there are three main mechanisms. Where do our preferences actually come from? Well, the first one is very simple, just exposure. But the important thing to know, the practical thing to know, is the exposure starts prior to birth, in utero. And the interesting thing about it, I just talked about flavour principles. Well, how does a culture maintain the same flavour principles, and how does it pass it on from generation to generation? Well, the flavours this fetus is exposed to are those in the mother's diet. And what is the mother eating? She's eating the foods of that culture. And what happens to this child when she's born and later on is that the flavours the mother was exposed to become preferred. So even at 2 years later, you can show that the mother's diet while pregnant influences the child. So simple exposure is a very, very important mechanism. The next mechanism I want to talk about is we like things when we pair them with something that's already liked. Now, I'm going to skip a lot of detail here because of time constraints. But for example, soft drink manufacturers know that when you put lots of sugar in something, we like sugar, our bodies like it, and the taste of sugar is very pleasant. And we pair a weird flavour like the flavour of Coca-Cola with it, we actually end up liking that flavour because it's been paired with something good. And you can see an example here from an experiment where we've just been pairing an odour together with sucrose and in solution, and the odour becomes more liked. Now, there are lots of examples, not just these sorts of experimental examples, but what do important people do? So pairing of somebody who's important with a food or a beverage, pairing it with adults, with our peers, with role models, with celebrities. Of course, that's what advertising does all the time. Something which is liked paired with something which is new, somehow the positive aspect gets transferred over the item that's new. And these data here show simply that a child who is exposed to an adult role model drinking a red drink out of a selection of different colours will choose the red drink more often. Comfort foods. What do we mean by that? Well, they're foods that help us feel better. Why? What is all that? Because through associations, once again. So our chicken or our pasta and so on, the flavour of that has been associated with something highly positive, namely our family, our friends, our home, our hearth, our culture, our country. And the final mechanism, and these all go together, but we can distinguish them. Final mechanism really helps us explain why we tend to eat things which are bad for us, and things like fat, things like salt, things like sugar. And the answer is very simple. If you remember why we like salt and why we like sugar and why we like fat, because the body wants them. They're source of energy in the case of sugar and fat. And you can show that, in fact, when you pair a flavour with a nutrient that the body values, in this case it's monosodium glutamate, and the body values that in fact this is a change in liking for a soup with which it's been repeatedly paired, it becomes very, very liked. How do we know that this is because the body values it? Well, on the right-hand side, I'm showing that these pairings work very well when you're hungry and much less well when you're not hungry. And if you're pairing a flavour with aspartame, for example, instead of sucrose, actually there's not much change because it doesn't provide the body with any energy. Okay, I'll wrap it up. Now let's see. What else did I want to say? Well, of course we can do the converse, and that is we compare things with an unpleasant experience like quinine and produce dislikes, but I don't have time to go on that. One final point I'd like to make, because this is an important point to do with health, and that's this. When we pair a flavour with a nutrient, something the body values, we get to like it. But the other thing that happens, we now know, is that flavour can induce hunger and it can increase intake. In other words, the body is telling us that the flavour is now a signal for something we should be eating. Eat it now, eat more of it. And as a result, what happens is that anything that's paired with something the body likes gets to be a signal for something we should eat. I don't have time to go into that study now, sorry. I wanted to point out that simply sensory cues that are associated with ingested nutrients, like fat, like sugar, come to induce what is now being called hedonic hunger. And this is one reason why diets don't work at all, because the diet says, well, we want you to reduce those things that the body craves, namely things with fat and sugar in them, things that give you pleasure. I think that's a warning for me. I think the bolt of lightning is coming next. But the things that give you pleasure are the things that we crave because we crave them hedonically. We crave them for pleasure. And if you don't think about the fact that people eat for pleasure, you can't possibly understand how you can get them to eat healthier diets. Leaves do not satisfy hedonic hunger, by the way. I just thought I'd mention that. Look, I'm going to leave it there. I think I'm over time. I hope you found it interesting, and if you'd like to ask me any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you very much.